be encouraged each day in understanding you and what you have planned for our lives. In Jesus' name, amen. Today we're going to cover partially the third most significant event in human history. Well, it's probably the fourth, the flood of Noah, and then the consequences. What we have in the Lord has used in all of history, in the span of the scriptures, basically it looks like a skeleton of humans to build this, to flesh out his program of the ages. And that's why the genealogy is so important. And although we represent now over 5 billion people in the world, we have a line of genealogies and ancestry and history that everything will be built on from the beginning to the end of history. And it's like a skeleton, and then the flesh is built upon this skeleton of people that are, even Christ himself programmed himself into this program to be a part of this human race, to play a role himself, even though he's God, to play a role and integrate himself. And he's set a line in this thing, beginning from Adam, through himself, to be the masterpiece of the human race and to carry it out. And that's why we're going to go into these genealogies. We're not looking at long times in the past, and that we're all more closely related than we'd like to be, maybe. And that the human race is not divided into races as most people think. We're divided between, from Adam, all the way back to Cain. We're divided between the good and the bad, the righteous and the unrighteous, the saved and the lost in human history. So that we'll find that this separation in mankind even splits our own families. Even though we're genetically linked to our brothers, our sisters, our mother and father, that the separation is a world of difference between the saved and the unsaved. And that's why the chronologies, the genealogies, and the plans that God has made is built upon these covenants, and the dispensational plan. You'll understand the scriptures from the beginning to end as you see God's plan unfolding in humans. You often wondered, well, why the book of Kings? Or why the book of Chronicles? And these things. Why the genealogies are so important in the beginning of the Gospels, Matthew and Luke. Why do they devote so much time to who begat someone else? Why is that important? Because this is a skeleton that God has chosen to build human history on. And we'll see it here. We are ourselves even part of this structure. And the good part, hopefully. And that there are others that are around us, even in our own families, that are of the bad part. That their destinies are like the Cains in history, even though they have certain parents, or the sons of the men you see, Samuel, Eli, and others in history, righteous men who have unrighteous children whose destinies are entirely different from their parents. And vice versa is true. We have very ungodly parents who have very righteous children. And it becomes part of, particularly in our age, of the new covenant. So let's begin with just a reading of what took place with the man Noah. The setting, as we saw from the last time, is that mankind began in the Garden of Eden, a very pleasant relationship with God, very pure, holy, in innocence. But that degenerated with only one command they had to do. And we have fights all through society today of, I don't want to do this and I don't want to do that. And theirs, that had probably the greatest impact, was just a question of eating one piece of fruit off of one tree. The price of that was terrible, absolutely terrible. I mean, every time my car breaks down, every time I feel aches and pains, or every time, like this week, we had some of this flu that ran through us, and I fortunately didn't get it, but some of my kids did. And I mean, they were out laying on the ground, heaving, and the pain was just gripped their whole bodies. They couldn't even think. And it swept over them like a plague. All because of the disobedience of Adam and Eve, our parents. And not that far back, not that many generations back. We're not looking at eons of things that evolution teaches you of millions of years and this descent and someone in the way past, and that there's a struggle of the survival of the fittest based on races and things as Darwin promoted. Racism really is deeply entrenched in the whole concept of evolution. All Hitler was doing was carrying out what Nietzsche and those had proposed. And where did they get their ideas? Darwin. Where did the Marxists get their ideas? Darwin. Darwin's more important to the communist system than Marx was. It's all built on these ideas of something of a godless origins way back in the past by time and chance, and therefore we can go out and kill those that are less fit. We can kill the old people. We can kill the people that aren't as fit. We can produce a master race by that concept of evolution. And Margaret Sanger in the Planned Parenthood was a racist of the first kind. They had a nice name for it. They called it eugenics, good breeding. And in reality, it ended up being firing the furnaces of the gulags and of the death camps. So we go back, and mankind is divided from the beginning. In the time after Adam and Eve, you have a time in which you have no governments. You have no courts. You have no police. You officially have no armies. You have nothing. It's a time of conscience. When God had arranged for that, there was no eating of meat. There were some strange things. In fact, there was no rain in the world. The world was artificially supplied by an artesian effect from beneath. But mankind in this time, there were giants born in this time, the Raphaim and Nephiim that appear in the scriptures, the mighty men of old, as they called them. We have deified it. Our pagan ancestors deified them, and that's why all the systems of the godheads of Zeus and Jupiter and all these are all exactly the same. They're drawing upon, they deified these demigods. And demigod means half god, like Hercules and Atlas, are in reality probably the offspring of the sons of God going into the daughters of men, seeing that they're fair and having offspring. That term is used of angels. And there are a fallen set of angels who are locked up in chains. To this day, we know from Jude and 1st and 2nd Peter, to this very day, they stepped over the bounds because it says as in Sodom and Gomorrah, they went after strange flesh. The product of that union were these giants who turned out to be very ungodly people. That line may have been carried across in the flood through the line of Ham, through the Canaanites, who appear again as Raphaim, the giants, Goliath and all those things, the sons of Anak, the Emim and the Zamzumi were giants that occupied that part of the world, and that God had designated them to be eradicated for that. But they were giants, like the spies went in and said, these were like grasshoppers in their eyes. They're giants, and their cities are fortresses we cannot penetrate. The fruit of the land is, as God said, very good, but these giants occupy it, and we're afraid to go in there. They were probably a carryover from the giants genetically through the line of Ham, particularly the Canaanites. His son Cain carried that, and that's probably why there's a curse upon that line. It's hard to understand everything, but again, it's tied to humans. Well, as this continued after Seth and on down to the time of Noah, it got worse and worse. And we pick this up in Genesis in 6, verse 1. Now it came to pass when the men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. Like I said, in the Old Testament, this term sons of God is not used of humans. Very rarely. It's generally used of angelic means. And God said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. Up to this time in this what we call antediluvian, it means before the flood, the deluge, the average age of these people is over 900 years. The antediluvians, and he's saying as a judgment, they're going to fall down to 120 years. There were giants on the earth in those days. And also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, they were the mighty men of old, men of renown. These are the offspring of this ungodly union. And that's why God says the wickedness. Then he says, then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart were only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. You notice these are all just terrestrial creatures here. He isn't going to wipe out the fish and the things in the sea. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. This is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God. And Noah begat 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The earth was also corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and outside with pitch. And this is how you shall make it. And then he describes this thing. Now, what's interesting is that Noah's building this thing in a world in which there's no rain. So the logical place would be down by the sea, but evidently he's built this thing up on the land someplace. And he's building a thing that's 450 feet long. This is a giant thing. And it looks like he was commanded to do this in his 500th year, because that's when his sons were beginning to be born. And the flood didn't begin until the 600th year of Noah's life, so he spent 100 years building this thing. Now, he didn't get a government grant or some assistance from his neighbors to build this thing, so he's out there with his sons in their time, growing their food and everything else and building this ark at the same time. So it's a long process, and he has a lot of time for people to ridicule him. He has a lot of times to have second thoughts about it. But Noah continues for 100 years building this crazy ark. But as what takes place afterwards, we realize that he takes 2 of everything to preserve the terrestrial creatures with him on this thing, 7 of the good ones and of the clean ones, and of 7 pairs, and only 1 pair of the unclean. And in this, as he finishes the building of this thing, the Lord tells him it's time to go in. So he gathers all these creatures, goes into the ark, and the Lord himself closes up the door and seals the outside of it. So it's watertight. It's made watertight from the outside. If anyone's worked with anything, you know you can't make something watertight from the inside. It'll just blow through. So the Lord himself seals this thing up with pitch, and then the rains begin. And this flood lasts the main rains are only for 40 days and 40 nights, but the waters continue to rise for 150 days, and then they descend, and it's a full year before they see land again and come out. It's over a year. At the end of this time, then Noah, in chapter 9 at the end, actually it's in 8, at the end of 8, Noah comes out, and there's dry land, and it says in verse 20 of chapter 8, verse 20, then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took of every clean animal and every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. See, he took on 7 so he could afford to sacrifice 1 pair. And the Lord smelled a soothing aroma. Then the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground for man's sake, although the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Nor will I again destroy every living creature, every living thing that I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night shall not cease. God makes a covenant here with Noah. We call it the Noahic covenant. Men are given the right to eat food, eat meat at this point. Rain is given, and human government's instituted. If a man takes a man's life, his life will be required of him. It's the beginning of human government. Before this, there had been none. But the promise that God gives in this, and he sets the rainbow in the sky, he says, I will never again destroy the earth for man's sake. Now we know that man has not changed. You remember the Lord Jesus, it said, he trusted himself to no man. This is the Lord himself again, for he knew what was in the heart of man. So even at the time of Jesus, the heart of man has not changed. But God has made a covenant with him not to destroy him, all of mankind and all of the animals again. And again, he'll never use water to do that. In the end, the final judgment will be carried out with fire. The very elements themselves will burn up. And the end of history will be brought by the destruction of this whole universe that we see. So the things that we're going to cover tonight are, one, the chronologies, because in Genesis 5, which preceded this, tells of the generations from Adam, his beginning, until Noah. And then Genesis 11 takes it from Noah down to Abraham. And so we're going to see those genealogies. Now, these genealogies are important. One, because the first ones are very tight in Genesis 5. It tells you so many years until the one is born, the son is born. Now, the son may be a grandson or someone says there are gaps. There probably are. But from his time of his birth till the birth of this son or grandson or whatever he is, there's so many years. Then after this, the birth of this son till the time he dies are so many years. And then it gives the total years of his life. So there's no gap. It's locked tight. Now, in Genesis 11, it's a little looser in the sense that he tells the time from from the father's birth to the son's birth, and then he takes it from the son's birth to the end of his life, but he doesn't give the total years of his life. At this time, we're going to see too, in these genealogies, how tight they are. You'll also see why there was not need for special revelation, like the scriptures. We have long periods of time. Our generations are short. And none of us have seen Jesus. We're generations away from him. In the case of Noah, his grandfather, whom he knew Adam. So you're not talking about getting things 20th hand here. You're getting them second hand. And even in the case of Shem, who was Noah's son, he lived as long as Abraham did. They died about the same time. So Abraham would have known Shem, who would have known Lamech, his great-grandfather, who would have known Adam. So the worst you get in the offense of the garden is third hand. So there wasn't a need for a special revelation of Scripture. Everyone knew what was going on. Everyone knew who was who and everything. They're all related. They're a very close-knit group. It's not like us with 5 billion kinfolk out there, They were very tight. So let's go into this deal of this third section. And I've tied these things together. The chronology, that has to do with the time schedule, the timelines, covenants, and dispensations. Because these are going to play an important part in the history that God has developed from the eternity to eternity. And we'll understand the Scriptures a lot more if you understand covenants and the genealogies. You'll understand a lot better. If you'll understand the covenants, which are another way of covering this period of time from the eternity to eternity. And dispensations are another way of understanding the same things. And we'll show what the distinctions between these things are. Covenants, let's begin with them first. A covenant is a binding agreement, a contract. And another way of expressing it is God's promises to man as recorded in the Old and New Testament. A covenant is just like a contract. There are two people generally involved, and in its agreement between them and conditions. And what you have in the covenants that you have are exactly that. And the covenants in the scriptures are the covenant of Eden, the Edenic covenant. And that was the one that was until the fall of man. And this is the one which they lived in the Garden of Eden. That's why it's called the covenant of Eden. And it's conditional. It continued as long as man obeyed. There's a condition to it. If you obey this and don't eat of that fruit, this covenant will continue. But the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. And as soon as man broke that covenant, it was finished. It was conditional. The next one arrives with Adam, and it goes from the fall, and it applies to all of us, to the final judgment. And it's unconditional. It's given, and there's no condition. It's a judgment upon Adam, it's a judgment upon Eve, and it's a judgment on Satan, the serpent. There's a promise in it in Genesis 3 of the one where it says, you shall bruise his heel, but he shall crush your head. And so even in this period of time, he's given a promise of a redeemer. With it came death. The judgment was carried out. He was going to die. Man was going to have to work by the sweat of his brow all of his life. And the thorns and thistles would come up. For the woman, she was going to bear children with labor, and her desire would be for a husband. But the good part of it is in Genesis 3:15 that there's a promise of a redeemer in the future. And it applies to all mankind. Then we have the covenant with Noah, and it runs from the flood to the final judgment, and it's unconditional. What we mean by unconditional is that there's no conditions to it. These things are just stated, and they're true, and it doesn't require man's obeying anything. In some cases, they're harsh in these covenants, but that's the way the contract's written. Then you have the one of the Abrahamic covenant, and in these other cases, they were with all of mankind. Of course, there wasn't much mankind left after the flood of Noah, so it's just through his line. It's not all the descendants of Adam, but it applies to all of us because we're all, the people on the face of the earth, are descendants of Noah. Abraham is a particular line that's come into this, and it's the line of the redeemed, and it's made with Abraham, Israel, his descendants, and the Gentiles, and it lasts forever, and it's unconditional. If you look at Genesis 12, and 1 and 2 and 3 in there, you'll realize that this covenant that God makes with Abraham, his descendants, and the Gentiles that will be blessed through him are unconditional. It's not, if you disobey, this will happen to you. There's no conditions in it. It's an unconditional covenant with God that God makes with Abraham. Then you have the Mosaic covenant, which is the one that's established with the nation of Israel, and it exists until the new covenant described in Jeremiah 31. That there will be a new covenant that comes that abrogates the Mosaic covenant. And it's a conditional covenant completely. And that's why it's abrogated. That there's a blessing and a cursing all written through the law of Moses. And the cursings are tough. And they violated those conditions and they lost the whole thing. Christ was the only one that could fulfill that thing. And so he becomes the promise and the heir, but he also becomes the one that not only fulfills the law, but brings it down. And you'll see in the New Testament, one of the toughest struggles that the early church did, which was largely Jewish, getting together like in Acts 15 and determining, do the Gentiles have to become Jews to be included? No, was the conclusion. They do not have to be. The old system is finished. And we see the destruction of the temple and everything shortly thereafter. I worked for some, my bosses in North Africa were Jews, Sephardic Jews. They treated me very nicely, but we had some tough discussions. And I said, doesn't it seem strange that God, who controls all of history, made it impossible for you to continue the fulfillment of the law, the 613 commandments? You can hardly do any of them because there's no temple, there's no priesthood, and you've established traditions that are unbiblical, the synagogue, and all your traditions are drawn outside of the law. You have no more sacrifices, no more provision of sin, no intermediaries. Where are the Cohens? And they kind of struck them. They never thought about that because they're into dietary laws of what's kosher, what isn't kosher, all this type of stuff, separation of dairy products from meat products, built upon certain parts of the law, and they're all wrapped up in this thing. And I was waiting. They said, let's talk about something else. So we did. But this law of Moses exists until the new covenant comes. And at that point, God made it impossible for the Jews or anyone else to fulfill that. Now, we have Christians, the Reconstructionists and the Theonomists, who are trying to reinstitute the law. And you even see it in Christendom. Earlier, others that are not happy, but they're trying to carry the law. But you say, what part of the law? Are you going to become a Jew that you can do this? Where's your inheritance? Where's your lineage? You have no genealogies. You know? And a lot of they said, we will obey the moral law. And they divide the law up into moral law and into the social law and to the ritual law. And you can't make that division. The law, like Paul says, if you break one bit of the law, you've broken it all. So this Mosaic law continues until the new covenant comes. There's a Palestinian covenant made with the nation of Israel, giving them the land of Palestine. And the whole trouble that we have in the Middle East is other people want it, particularly the other descendants of Abraham, the Arabs, through Ishmael. We have no offense here, Ishmael. But they are trying to acquire the rights that they do not have. They do not have a covenant. We do not, as Christians, do not have, unless we're Jewish, of course, have no part in the Palestinian covenant. It's to the nation of Israel. Then there's the Davidic covenant, and that's made with the particular line that the Messiah comes through, that David's seed will reign forever on the throne of Israel. Now, part of it's unconditional, and part of it's conditional. The unconditional part is that will be fulfilled by Christ. But for the ones in between, he's told, if your sons will obey me and carry out my law, they shall remain on the throne. If they don't, I get rid of them. So there's a conditional aspect to the Davidic covenant. Of course, when Christ comes along, it's all fulfilled and there's no more kings after Christ. There are no more that can claim that throne, no more pretenders to the throne of David. It's finished. The unconditional part now is done. Then we have the new covenant, and that's with mankind in general, and it takes place after the death of Christ. And that's the one in which the Gentiles are also included. And it's a new covenant that was foreseen in the Old Testament. The inclusion of the Gentiles was a new revelation, a part of, as Paul said, that was hidden in the ages past, but has now been revealed, that you who were without God and without hope in this world now have been included. And God's made one in the church out of two. So then the new covenant, which includes the church, we have a union of believed people, both from Israel and from the Gentiles. But it's conditional too. It requires belief. It doesn't include all of mankind. Without belief and faith, they have no part in it. So it divides, again, mankind right down the middle. Those that are included in the covenant and who have met the condition of faith and acceptance, and those that haven't. The unconditional part doesn't apply to those that reject. So these are the covenants, and you can begin to understand from Eden until the final judgment how God is working with covenants. Some of them conditional, some of them fully of grace and unconditional. No conditions apply. So these are the understanding of covenants. Now, let me go back a little bit in time to the beginning. When God's created man, then he takes him into the Garden of Eden. And he has a personal relationship with God that we will not see again until after the final judgment, where people can see him face to face. And they'll have that when you die since Christ. Yes, you can go into his presence, but you don't have a bodily form until the final resurrection. He's given this. He establishes the covenant of Eden with them, but he says in the day that you shall eat of the tree, you shall surely die. And that covenant is finished. It exists no more. And in fact, to make sure it wasn't, God said, angel at the guard to the place that they shall not live forever, and that they can't come back and eat of the tree of life, lest they live forever. That's how severe this thing is. That covenant will never rise again. Also, the Adamic covenant falls on all people. And here's the death of Abel by Adam and Eve seeing him dead. He's killed by his brother Abel. It's finished. And it falls upon all of us, and we all are touched as descendants of Adam and Eve by the problem of sin. Now, in the genealogies, I wanted to go through these just briefly. What we have here is in Adam, what these do is it shows the age at the time he bore Seth, how many years he lived afterwards, and the total years of his life. And these two always add up to this one, unless I've made a mistake on this chart. And then Seth is 106 years old when he gives birth, his wife gives birth to Enosh. And then he lives 807 years after that, and then the total years of his life is 912, okay? What we're doing is we're going to add these up here down to Noah, and then the flood, we're tracing it actually from Adam to the flood, not just to Noah. Noah 600 years, so we add these up from the creation of Adam until the flood is 1,656 years from the creation of Adam to the flood. Now, a couple of interesting things I think Ishmael pointed out in his talk. Methuselah, his grandfather, dies in the year of the flood. And it tells us probably is an unrighteous man. We're not sure. His father, Lamech, dies 5 years before the flood. The average age, if you include these shorter ones, even Methuselah, is 912 years of natural life. So this takes us, why we're adding these things up is then we're going to go down to a known date, which was the beginning of the building of the temple, and add these years back up so we know what the date of the creation of Adam was, backwards. Archbishop Usher said there was 4004. That's not exactly right, and you'll see why. But it's not, he wasn't far off. So we have 1,656 years from the creation of Adam until the flood. God said to Noah, make an ark. This is what we're talking about. And everyone's probably out there. They don't show the other people laughing at them as they're building this ark. At the end of the flood, Noah comes out, sets up a deal, and God makes his covenant with him. He says, I will establish my covenant with you and your descendants in Genesis 6 before the flood. And then when he comes out, then he reestablishes it. Now the genealogies in 11 go from the flood to Abraham. And do you remember before he said their days shall become 120 years? Well, you can see if you add these up, you're a long ways away from that. In fact, Shem lives to be like, well, what was Shem's time there if you add his life up? Well, we don't have it here. But he lived to be almost to the time of, he died about the same time as Abraham. So he lives almost, 700 years or something like that, 600 years. But here, the times of the birth are a lot shorter than before. And the times that they live after, you can see a decline here, a rapid, relatively exponential decline. The number of years are such that there's, he was 2 years old, Arphaxad, or whatever you call him, was 2 years old, and he was 35 years old when he had Salah. So I put in 37 years after the flood was the birth of Salah. And these, again, it doesn't show the total years of their life except in the case of Terah. It explains that he was 205 when he died. So you can see this decline. So we add these up. So there's 552 years between the flood and the birth of Noah. The way we arrive at this figure, it says when he was 70 years old, he had these 3 sons, but it doesn't work out right. And so you know from the passage that Abraham was 75 years when he left Haran. We're assuming that his father, Terah, died in Haran at 205. So we just subtract that to get that 130 years old when he had him. We assume that Terah died at 205 years in Haran in the same year that Abraham leaves Haran, or it should be Abram, but it's later Abraham, at 75 years old. Then Terah is 130 years old when Abraham was born. So that's where we come up with that figure. It's not explicitly stated in there. So what we have is now we have 1,656 years to Noah, to the flood, and from the flood down to the birth of Abraham, 352 years. Then you have in the time of Abraham has a son at 100 years old, Isaac. He's told to go out and sacrifice him, but he's told before this, I will make my covenant between me and you. Now, he puts a tough requirement on Abraham, and we sometimes have times to obey God, and things are very clear that have no moral implications. This has a moral implication of killing your son, which is a serious deal, but he was told to do that. But his act of faith is that he went out as if he was going to do it. And as you see this painting of Rembrandt, the angel stops him as he's reaching for the knife to cut his son's throat and sacrifice him. And God supplied the ram that was caught in the brush nearby. But Abraham carried out obeyed God's law, even though it was contrary to his nature and contrary to the fact that he knew that he should not kill anyone. Abraham. So now we go from Abraham down to Egypt. Abraham's 100 years old at the birth of Isaac, Genesis 21. Isaac then is 60 years old at the time of Jacob. He was married for 20 years before they were able to have a child. He pleaded with God for Rebekah, and she has Jacob. And then Jacob he has the 12 sons of Israel. His other name is Israel. They're the 12 tribes. And Pharaoh asks him when he enters Egypt, he says, how old are you? He says, my days have been long and evil. Many of the days of my life that are evil. And he says, I'm only 130 years old. And he died not long after he entered Egypt. So we know from the time of Abraham's birth down to the beginning of the exile, it's 290 years by adding those up. Moses receives the law of God, from God. And in the Mosaic covenant it says, if you will keep my covenant, This is in Genesis 19. This should be, I'm sorry, this isn't Genesis, this is Exodus 19, wrong verse. It's right before the law is given in Exodus 20. And he's told this, I will establish, and this is the establishment of what we call the Mosaic covenant, the law, which is so sacred to the Jews. They consider almost Moses is more important than Abraham, our father. They consider Moses. But it's conditional. And the Jews, to this day, have never fulfilled that covenant. They have never kept the law. They didn't keep the days of the Jubilee or any of those things. In fact, God says when he took him in the exile, the Babylonian captivity, he says, I'm doing this so that the land gets those 70 years that you robbed it of. I'm going to fulfill it even if you don't. So the thing's full of conditions. The chronology we have here, in adding them up, we have from the creation of Adam to the flood, 1,656 years. From the flood to the birth of Abraham, 352. From the birth of Abraham to the beginning of exile, 290. Entrance into Egypt to the exit was 430 years. We know this from Galatians 3:17. It was 430 years they were in the land. Then from the Exodus to the beginning of the temple, we know that it's 480 years because in 1 Kings 6:1 it says, in the 4th year of the reign of Solomon, he began to build the temple, which was the 480th year after the exile. And we know that his reign began in 970, so the 4th year is 966. And you add this to this, and you get this. The Exodus in 1446.